this episode, we're going to connect three ideas that beginners often treat as separate chores: where personal information is stored, how long it is kept, and what happens when it moves into long-term archives. Storage, retention, and archiving are not just technical housekeeping, because they shape privacy risk every day a system runs. If you keep data longer than you need, you increase the chance it will be exposed, misused, or misunderstood, and you also make it harder to answer basic questions like what data exists and why. If you delete too soon or store carelessly, you can break product functions, disrupt customer support, or fail to meet legal obligations to keep records. The skill is to build a life cycle that is intentional and defensible, meaning you can explain why data lives where it lives, why it is kept as long as it is, and how it is protected throughout its life. You will hear people talk about privacy as if it is only about collection, but long-term harm often comes from long-term storage, because time turns yesterday's useful data into today's unnecessary liability. By the end, you should be able to describe how to align storage and retention decisions with real needs without letting data accumulate by inertia. A strong place to start is to define these terms in plain language, because confusion leads to bad design. Storage is the act of keeping data in a system so it can be used later, which could mean a database, a file store, backups, or replicated environments. Retention is the policy and practice of deciding how long data should be kept before it is deleted, de-identified, or otherwise removed from active use. Archiving is moving data out of active systems into a long-term repository, usually because it is needed less often but still must be kept for a valid reason, like legal record-keeping, auditability, or historical analysis. The privacy challenge is that archiving often feels like moving data out of sight, but it does not move data out of responsibility. In fact, archives can be harder to manage because they are accessed less frequently, making misconfigurations and forgotten access paths more likely. Beginners also need to understand that retention is not only about the data in the main system. It includes copies, exports, logs, and backups, which can quietly keep information alive even when the primary record is deleted. When you define the full scope correctly, you design the life cycle with fewer blind spots. The first alignment problem is legal need, which means understanding what laws, regulations, and contracts require you to keep or delete. Even without naming specific statutes, the principle is that some data must be retained for a minimum period, such as financial records, transaction histories, or records needed to resolve disputes. At the same time, many privacy rules and expectations push you not to keep data longer than necessary, especially when the purpose has ended. This creates a tension that privacy engineering must solve with clarity rather than guesswork. A beginner-friendly way to think about it is that legal need defines a floor for some categories of data, while privacy and minimization often define a ceiling for the same categories. Your job is to design policies that sit between the floor and the ceiling, and to document the reasoning so it is defensible. Another legal dimension is the ability to respond to rights requests, such as requests to access or delete data, which requires you to know where data lives and whether archive copies are in scope. If you cannot locate data across storage layers, you cannot reliably meet legal obligations. The second alignment problem is business need, which is often less precise than legal need and therefore easier to inflate. Businesses want data for customer support, product improvement, fraud prevention, and operational troubleshooting, but those needs vary in time. For example, support needs might be high during an active relationship and drop after an account is closed, while fraud investigations might require a window of history but not indefinite storage. A common beginner mistake is to assume that because data might be helpful, it should be stored forever, but indefinite retention is rarely necessary and frequently harmful. A better approach is to define the business question the data supports, the time window where it is actually used, and the least sensitive form that still supports the need. Often, older data can be summarized or de-identified while preserving business value, such as keeping aggregate metrics while deleting detailed personal records. This is where privacy and business can align nicely. Keeping less detail over time can reduce risk and reduce storage and management costs while still enabling trend analysis. When business needs are treated as specific and time-bound, retention schedules become easier to justify and operate. Designing storage responsibly begins with data segmentation, which means separating data by sensitivity, purpose, and access needs rather than mixing everything together. If highly sensitive personal information is stored alongside general activity logs in the same location with the same access model, the whole system becomes risky. Segmentation can be conceptual, like separate datasets or separate schemas, or it can be organizational, like different teams owning different stores with clear boundaries. The key point for beginners is that storage design influences who can access data and how hard it is to apply retention rules. If everything is in one giant pool, applying selective deletion or restricted access becomes complex and error-prone. Segmentation also supports the principle of least privilege, because different users can be granted access only to the segments they need. Another benefit is containment. If one segment is exposed, the blast radius is smaller than if everything was stored together. Storage design is therefore a privacy control, not just an engineering choice. Retention schedules are the practical heart of this topic, and they work best when they are structured around data categories and events. A data category is a meaningful grouping like account profile data, transaction data, support communications, security logs, or analytics identifiers. An event is a trigger like account creation, last login, order completion, account closure, or the end of a contract. Rather than picking arbitrary time periods, you tie retention to a category and an event that signals the purpose has been fulfilled or the legal clock begins. For example, data used to deliver a service might be kept while the service is active and then for a short period afterward to handle returns or disputes, while compliance records might be retained for a longer fixed period. Beginners should notice that retention is not one number for the whole company. It is a set of rules that reflect different reasons for keeping different types of data. Retention schedules also need a decision about what happens at the end: delete, de-identify, anonymize, or archive, each with different privacy and operational implications. When retention is designed this way, it becomes easier to implement consistently and to explain to stakeholders. Archiving deserves special attention because it is often where privacy intent quietly degrades over time. Archives can become dumping grounds, where data is moved out of active systems without clear ownership or a clear plan for eventual disposal. A well-designed archive has a defined purpose, such as meeting audit obligations or preserving records required by law, and it has tighter access controls than active systems, not looser ones. It also has clear indexing and metadata, so you can locate records when needed, including for legal inquiries, audits, or requests from individuals. Another key design element is that archives should not be optimized for broad exploration the way analytics systems are, because broad exploration increases the risk of repurposing. Archives should be designed for retrieval under controlled conditions, with logging and oversight. Beginners often assume archives are cold and safe, but the risk is that because archives are accessed rarely, security reviews and retention enforcement can be neglected. Good archiving design keeps responsibility active even when the data is not. Backups and disaster recovery are another area where retention can fail if you only think about primary storage. Backups are copies made to restore systems after failures, and they often contain personal information because they replicate whole databases or storage volumes. If you delete a record in the primary system, but that record remains in backups for months or years, the data still exists and may still be recoverable. This creates both privacy and operational complexity, because you must balance the need to restore systems with the need to limit how long personal information persists. A thoughtful design might use shorter backup retention windows for systems containing highly sensitive data, or might rely on techniques that reduce the sensitivity of what is backed up, such as minimizing stored fields in the first place. Another approach is to treat backups as a special category with clear access restrictions and strict handling, because restoring a backup should be a controlled operation, not an everyday convenience. Beginners should understand that backups are not a loophole where privacy rules stop applying. They are part of the data lifecycle and must be included in retention planning. When backups are ignored, organizations discover too late that deleted data was never truly gone. Operationalizing retention requires automation and governance, because manual deletion and manual archive management tend to fail at scale. Systems generate data continuously, and people change roles, teams change tools, and business needs evolve. If your retention rules depend on someone remembering to run a cleanup, the rules will be inconsistently applied, and that inconsistency becomes a risk in itself. Automation can include scheduled deletion processes, automatic de-identification after a time window, and built-in archive transitions triggered by lifecycle events. Governance includes ownership, meaning someone is accountable for the dataset and its retention behavior, and review, meaning retention schedules are revisited when products change. Beginners should see that a retention policy that is not enforced in systems is not really a control, because it does not change what happens to data. Verification is part of operationalization too, where you check that data is actually being deleted or archived as intended, and that old copies are not silently accumulating. When retention is automated and verified, privacy risk decreases and operational predictability improves. Another important piece is designing for exceptions without letting exceptions swallow the rule. Some situations require holding data longer, such as litigation holds, fraud investigations, or regulatory inquiries, where data that would otherwise be deleted must be preserved. The risk is that organizations apply broad holds too often or keep holds in place longer than necessary, effectively turning exceptions into indefinite retention. A defensible design treats holds as narrowly scoped, time-bound, and documented, with clear criteria for starting and ending the hold. It also limits access to held data and logs any access because held data is often sensitive and tied to high-stakes situations. Beginners can think of this like pausing the normal schedule for a specific reason, not canceling the schedule forever. When exceptions are handled carefully, you can meet legal and investigative needs without abandoning minimization. If exceptions are uncontrolled, they become a common justification for keeping everything, which undermines privacy intent across the entire system. Storage and retention decisions also interact with security controls in ways beginners should recognize. The longer you keep sensitive data, the more time attackers have to find it, and the more likely it is that security assumptions will change, such as older encryption methods becoming weaker or older systems becoming harder to patch. Retention also affects insider risk, because long histories create more opportunities for misuse, such as someone browsing old records without a valid reason. Storage location matters too, because putting sensitive data in many places increases the number of access points that must be protected and monitored. Good design reduces duplication, keeps sensitive data in fewer, well-controlled locations, and ensures that archived data is not easier to access than active data. Another security dimension is audit logging, because you want to know when archived or retained data is accessed, especially if access is rare. When privacy and security are treated as connected, retention becomes a way to reduce the attack surface, not merely a compliance checkbox. This is why privacy engineering often recommends retaining only what is needed and protecting what remains with appropriate controls. A frequent misconception is that archiving solves the problem of retention because it feels like you are cleaning up the active environment, but archiving can actually make the problem worse if it lacks an end-of-life plan. If data is moved into an archive and never deleted, you have simply relocated indefinite retention. Another misconception is that retention can be uniform, such as keeping everything for 7 years, because uniformity seems simple. Uniform retention is usually overbroad, because some data categories need far less time and some need a different treatment, and overbroad retention increases unnecessary exposure. Beginners should also be cautious of the idea that retention is only about old data, because the design choices that create retention risk happen early, like collecting extra fields, replicating data to multiple systems, and allowing uncontrolled exports. When you design storage with segmentation, define retention with category and event triggers, and design archiving with purpose and control, you are creating a system that naturally limits risk over time. That is the real objective. A life cycle that prevents unnecessary accumulation rather than relying on periodic cleanup projects. As we conclude, the key lesson is that storage, retention, and archiving should be designed as a coherent life cycle that matches legal obligations and real business needs, while minimizing risk and preserving privacy intent. Good design begins with clear definitions and a complete view of where data lives, including active databases, analytics stores, logs, exports, backups, and archives. It continues with retention schedules that are tied to data categories and lifecycle events, with clear actions at the end of the retention period such as deletion or de-identification. Archiving should be purposeful and controlled, with strong access limits, logging, and a plan for eventual disposal, rather than becoming a place where data is forgotten but still exists. Operational success comes from automation, ownership, verification, and careful handling of exceptions like legal holds. When you can explain why each dataset is stored where it is, how long it is kept, and how it exits the system in a verifiable way, you have built a defensible approach that supports both privacy and reliable operations.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.